6 years. That is how long I have invested in a facade of compliance. 6 years of lukewarm coffee, orchestrated smiles, and the necessity of suppressing my own dignity to a point where I could taste the bitterness in the back of my throat. It ended abruptly with a single phone call from a man in his bathrobe on Friday the 13th. I would like to claim that the sudden termination took me by surprise, but that would be a lie. I was not surprised. I was, above all else, prepared. Welcome back to the Sterling Clause. Grab a seat, and keep in mind that the individuals in these accounts were afforded every opportunity to conduct themselves with integrity. They simply chose to do otherwise. To understand the architecture of this downfall, we must look beyond the phone call. It begins on a rainy afternoon in March, 2 years prior, on the 18th floor of a premier office tower in Barangaroo. I was buried deep within a filing cabinet, searching for a misplaced vendor contract that Peggy, the office administrator, swore she had filed under V, while I suspected she had archived it based on nothing more than her fleeting whims. The contract remained elusive, but in its place, I discovered a dust-covered manila folder wedged behind the hanging files. The tab was inscribed with a dated elegance. Sterling Equity Partners, Founding Charter and Bylaws, Origin 1987. I nearly returned it to the shadows of the cabinet. I cannot say with certainty what compelled me to sit down and read it. Perhaps it was mere boredom, or perhaps it was a resentment that had aged far longer than boredom ever could. Working for your father-in-law is not merely employment. It is a permanent indictment of where you stand in someone else's narrative. From a moment Claire introduced us 17 years ago at a dinner in Vaucluse, Arthur Sterling had made it unequivocally clear that I was merely a supporting character in his expansive, self-aggrandizing story. He had inspected me with the detached, dismissive scrutiny one might reserve for a used vehicle one had no intention of purchasing. When I mentioned my background in financial consulting, he nodded with the same condescending grace one might offer to a hobbyist. It never improved. Every morning at the Barangaroo office was a reminder that I was a subordinate, an annoyance, a young man, to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. I read every page of that founding charter slowly. By the time I reached Section 14, subsection C, the world outside that window, the gray, rain-swept harbor of Sydney, seemed to shift. I had found the flaw in the foundation of the Sterling Kingdom, and for the first time in 6 years, I understood exactly how the end would be written. The memory of that dinner in Vaucluse remains as vivid as if it occurred yesterday. It was the moment the hierarchy of my existence in Arthur Sterling's world was cemented. The residence was a testament to his obsession with status, a sprawling property overlooking the harbor, filled with art that he liked but did not understand, and guests who laughed at his jokes because they were terrified of the silence that would follow if they didn't. When Claire introduced us, Arthur did not offer a handshake. He offered an inspection. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my suit with a subtle, dismissive curl of his lip that signaled he had already cataloged me as a non-essential asset. When I described my professional experience in financial consulting, he nodded slowly, his expression one of polite indulgence, as if I had just informed him I spent my weekends collecting antique stamps. That evening was the template for the next 6 years. It was never overt, never a shouting match or an insult delivered in the heat of passion. Arthur was far too controlled, far too concerned with his public image for such pedestrian displays of temper. Instead, his cruelty was surgical, a masterclass in subtle degradation. It lived in the specific, patronizing tone he used to address me in board meetings, the way he would conveniently forget my contributions during briefings, and the constant, rhythmic reminders that I was there by his grace, not by my own merit. To Arthur, I was a peripheral character, an unpolished addition to his family whom he felt burdened to mentor. However, after that rainy afternoon in Barangaroo, my perspective shifted. Fundamentally, I began to view his patronizing gestures not as insults, but as data points. I realized that his entire persona was a facade of competence built upon the work of others and the inertia of a fortune he had inherited. He was a man who had never been forced to justify his position because he had never faced a challenge he couldn't buy his way out of. Every time he condescended to me, Every time he minimized my professional judgment, he was merely reinforcing the prison walls he had built around himself. I started to observe him with the cold, detached precision of a scientist studying a specimen under a microscope. I realized that my 6 years of compliance had not been a waste. They had been an education. I learned his triggers, his weaknesses, and his insurmountable reliance on the image of the invincible patriarch. I had been playing the role of the humble son-in-law, but in the silence of my own mind, I was already drafting the blueprints for his undoing. I knew that to trigger the mechanism buried in that 1987 charter, I needed to remain in his favor just long enough to reach the 5-year mark, while simultaneously documenting every detail of my tenure. The goal was no longer to succeed in his company. The goal was to ensure that when I finally departed, I would dismantle his kingdom piece by piece, starting with his arrogance. The specific clause in Section 14, subsection C, was written in the dense, archaic legal prose characteristic of the late 80s. Language designed to be impenetrable to the casual reader. It stated, "Any employee of Sterling Equity Partners who is terminated without documented cause, following no fewer than 5 years of continuous full-time service, shall be entitled to equity compensation equivalent to 18% of company shares, valued at the time of termination." I read those words 3 times, then a 4th, until the ink seemed to etch itself into my memory. This was not merely a provision. It was a structural vulnerability. That evening, I met my closest associate, a man of uncompromising integrity who understood the mechanics of corporate law better than anyone else I knew. We chose à quai, dimlili. Establishment in the rocks, where the sound of the harbor ferries provided a perfect shroud for our conversation. I sat across from him, the founding charter resting between our glasses. "Read this," I said, pointing to the highlighted text. He adjusted his glasses, his expression initially skeptical, then slowly transforming into one of genuine astonishment. When he looked up, his eyes searched mine for a sign of hesitation. "Do you realize what this implies?" he asked quietly. "This is not a lottery ticket. It is a legal mandate. If you manage to force his hand, he is legally obligated to surrender nearly a fifth of his life's work." I nodded, the gravity of the situation settling firmly into my consciousness. "He has never read these documents," I explained. "He inherited the firm, he inherited the wealth, and he has spent 30 years operating under the assumption that the company is his absolute fiefdom. He has never had to defend a single decision against a contractual reality." My associate leaned back, his gaze fixed on the harbor lights flickering across the water. "He will not relinquish that stake willingly," he cautioned. "He will fight you with every resource at his disposal. He will try to characterize your departure as a personal failure or a breach of professional conduct to avoid the payout. You must be prepared for an exhaustive, public battle." "I have already considered the risks," I replied, my voice steady. "The beauty of this clause is that it requires no negotiation. It is a contractual fact. The only variable is the termination itself. I do not need his consent. I only need his temper. If I can maintain a pristine professional record while becoming just irritating enough to compromise his composure, he will eventually do exactly what I need him to do. He will fire me in a moment of unchecked pride." The air in the room felt suddenly charged. I had moved beyond the realm of hypothetical planning. I was now architecting a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the Sterling family legacy. The path forward was clear: patience, absolute professionalism, and the strategic cultivation of his inevitable, prideful mistake. I knew that sharing this plan with Claire was the most critical step in my orchestration. She was 44, the sharpest intellect I had ever encountered, and arguably the only person who understood the true nature of Arthur Sterling's cruelty. Her life had been a long, quiet observation of her father's methodology, the way he systematically dismantled the confidence of others to fortify his own. Her mother, Margaret, had endured 20 years of this psychological attrition before finally gathering the courage to leave, a move Arthur had punished with years of exhausting legal warfare. Claire had never forgotten the image of her mother packing bags in silence, nor the way Arthur had utilized his wealth to transform a personal failure into a public spectacle of victimhood. We sat at our kitchen table in our home in Vaucluse. The founding charter spread out between us like a set of tactical blueprints. I did not need to explain the emotional weight of what I proposed. It was already there, reflected in the stillness of her expression. I walked her through the legal mechanics of Section 14, subsection C, and the strategic necessity of my planned provocation. She read the clause with the meticulous focus of a seasoned litigator, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally looked up, there was no fear, no hesitation, and certainly no sentimentality regarding the impending collapse of her father's firm. Instead, there was a profound, cold clarity. "He never read these documents," she said, her voice devoid of any surprise. "He was always too convinced of his own omnipotence to concern himself with the foundations his father built. He assumed that because he held the title, he held all the power." She placed her hand over the document, tracing the lines of the signature from 1987. "You understand that he will attempt to ruin you professionally if he realizes what you have done. He has spent decades mastering the art of the character assassination." I nodded, acknowledging the reality of the threat. "I have spent 6 years ensuring my professional record is entirely unimpeachable. Every project, every client interaction, and every performance review has been meticulously documented and archived. He will have no grounds to claim incompetence or misconduct. The only weapon he has left is his own unchecked ego." Claire looked out the window toward the harbor, and for a moment, the mask of the dutiful daughter dissolved completely. "He spent 20 years making my mother feel as though she were a liability to his legacy," she said quietly. "He spent 17 years treating you as a decorative, insignificant addition to his dinner parties. If this clause is the instrument by which he finally faces the reality of his own fallibility, then there is no other choice." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. We were no longer simply planning a departure. We were preparing to reclaim the dignity that Arthur Sterling had spent a lifetime systematically eroding. The following 2 years were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a performance of such exacting precision that it left me exhausted, yet invigorated. I adopted a strategy of strategic aggravation. My objective was simple: to remain the most competent employee at Sterling Equity Partners while becoming the most inconvenient obstacle in Arthur's daily narrative. I did not resort to insubordination, for that would have provided him with the documented cause he desperately craved. Instead, I weaponized efficiency and transparency. I began copying senior board members, specifically those known for their adherence to corporate governance, on emails that Arthur would have preferred to keep within the confines of his private office. I insisted on detailed, data-driven justifications for every one of his impulsive, ego-driven investment decisions. In our department meetings, I ceased my role as the supportive son-in-law. When he would launch into one of his interminable, self-serving anecdotes about his early days in the market, I no longer provided the polite, mandatory laughter. I would simply remain silent, my expression neutral, waiting for him to conclude so I could redirect the conversation back to the quarterly projections. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Arthur's confusion quickly curdled into a simmering, silent resentment. He was accustomed to a workforce that served as an echo chamber for his own brilliance, and my sudden refusal to participate in the charade was, to him, an unforgivable affront. I observed the transformation in his behavior through the glass walls of his office. He began to spend more time pacing, his jaw constantly set in that rigid, grinding line that Claire had warned me about since the beginning. He started holding clandestine, frantic meetings with Hank Prudhomme, his loyal but perpetually anxious deputy, clearly searching for some justification to remove me. Yet, every time he reviewed my file, he found nothing but stellar performance metrics, flawless reports, and a perfect attendance record. I was becoming the quintessential employee, and that was exactly what made me so intolerable to a man who required a subordinate to blame for his own inevitable lapses in judgment. Peggy, the office administrator, was the first to notice the shift in the dynamic. She was a woman who perceived everything and voiced nothing, the true custodian of the firm's secrets. On several occasions, I caught her watching me with a mixture of concern and growing admiration as I coolly navigated Arthur's mounting irritability. I knew that word of my odd behavior was filtering back to him through the staff, and I welcomed it. I was no longer a background character in his story. I had become the primary point of friction in his life. I was not breaking the rules. I was simply refusing to allow him to break me, and in the claustrophobic environment of the Barangaroo office, that was the most disruptive act I could have performed. The Paris idea was a calculated maneuver, planted with the subtle precision of a master strategist. Claire introduced the concept during a Sunday dinner at the Vaucluse estate, a setting where Arthur Sterling felt most secure in his role as the benevolent patriarch. She dropped the suggestion into the conversation like a stone into a still pond. No drama, no theatricality, just a statement of intent delivered with calm efficiency. Liam has not taken a significant leave in 6 years, she noted, refilling her water glass. Claire and I have decided to spend 2 weeks in Paris. This June. It is long overdue. Arthur, who was occupied with the ritualistic carving of a steak, paused momentarily. 2 weeks is a significant duration to be absent from the firm, he replied, his tone laced with that familiar, patronizing skepticism. He looked toward me, clearly expecting me to retract the suggestion or offer an apology for the inconvenience. I did neither. I simply maintained eye contact, my expression one of professional confidence. Claire, anticipating his hesitation, had already secured the administrative clearance. Human Resources has verified that Liam has 31 days of accrued vacation time, she stated, her voice even and detached. Donna Merritt in legal has already reviewed the scheduling and provided full authorization. The mention of Donna Merritt, the firm's most formidable legal mind, effectively neutralized Arthur's capacity to object without appearing blatantly obstructionist. He looked at me, searching for a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but he found none. I remained silent, allowing the weight of the approved authorization to settle over the table. I trust the firm will continue to function in my absence, I added, my voice calm. Arthur eventually returned his attention to his meal, his jaw tight. Have a productive time, then, he conceded, the words sounding more like a reluctant surrender than a well-wish. He had no way of knowing that this permission was the final key to the trap. By authorizing this trip, he was officially signing off on a duration of absence that would allow me to finalize the preparations for his departure from the firm. As we left that evening, I observed him watching us from the threshold of his estate, a man who believed he had merely granted a trivial request to a subordinate. He remained entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just facilitated the precise conditions necessary for his own undoing. The countdown had begun. I had my approval, my timeline, and the absolute certainty that the foundation of his kingdom was finally ready to crumble. The arrival in Paris was not a vacation. It was the activation of a final, irrevocable sequence. We landed on Friday, June 6th, and by the second day, I had begun the subtle, rhythmic process of pulling the pins from Arthur's composure. I sent him a photograph of the Eiffel Tower, accompanied by a caption of practiced indifference, an exceptional city, highly recommended. I received no acknowledgement, which was precisely the outcome I anticipated. By day 4, I instructed Peggy to push 3 non-critical, yet high-visibility client briefings into the following week. I knew the information would travel through the office hierarchy and reach Arthur's desk like rising water. Claire, meanwhile, maintained contact with Arthur's current wife, Constance, sending carefully curated glimpses of our time abroad, snapshots of rooftop dinners and leisurely mornings that were designed to highlight a life entirely unburdened by the demands of his firm. Day fell on Friday, June 13th. I was on our hotel balcony, coffee in hand, observing the city begin its morning cadence when my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen, saw the familiar notification for Arthur's private line, and looked through the glass door at Claire. She looked up, her expression calm, and offered a single, imperceptible nod. I answered the call. Arthur, I said, my tone as measured as if I were discussing a standard ledger entry. What in the world do you think you are doing? His voice thundered, the same voice that had intimidated 3 decades of subordinates. I am receiving reports that your entire department is running on autopilot. I have client calls pushed without my oversight, and you're standing in France consuming. What? Croissants? I allowed him to continue, listening to the familiar cadence of his indignation. He was spiraling, exactly as I had predicted. He reached the crescendo of his rant, claiming sole credit for the firm's existence and demanding my immediate return under threat of termination. You are finished, he declared, his pride blinding him to the contractual reality of the moment. We do not require someone who disappears when the work requires attention. You are lazy, Liam. I always suspected you lacked the character for this industry. I laughed, not a polite, measured chuckle, but a genuine, resonant sound of liberation that had been years in the making. Then, without a word of defense, I ended the call. Claire stepped into the doorway, her presence silent and steady. Did he say it? She asked. He said all of it, I confirmed. Outside, Paris remained indifferent to the crumbling kingdom on the other side of the world. We had 8 days left of our stay, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not feel the crushing weight of Arthur Sterling's expectations. The bridge had been burned, and the silence that followed on the line was not one of defeat, but the quiet of an impending structural collapse. The transition back to Sydney was a study in profound, heavy silence. We arrived on Sunday, June 15th, and from the moment I stepped into the arrival hall at Kingsford Smith Airport, I felt a peculiar atmospheric shift. It was as if the city itself were holding its breath, anticipating the collision I had set in motion. Claire drove, her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the road with an intensity that suggested she was already calculating the final exit strategy. We did not discuss the office, the board, or the inevitable confrontation waiting for us on Monday morning. We simply existed in the quiet, a space free from the performance of the last 6 years. I had learned during my tenure at Sterling Equity Partners that the most destabilizing force against a man who craves control is not vocal opposition, but absolute, unnerving silence. I chose not to contact the office, not to provide a resignation letter, and not to engage in the customary negotiation of a departure. I simply ceased to exist within Arthur's reach. In the halls of his firm, my absence became a vacuum that Arthur, in his paranoia, would undoubtedly attempt to fill with his own anxieties. On Sunday evening, my associate stopped by our home in Vaucluse. He arrived with the energy of a man who had been monitoring the slow-motion detonation of a skyscraper. "Walk me through it," he said, settling into the armchair. I recounted the conversation from Paris, focusing on the moment I laughed and ended the call. He sat in silence for a long moment, then looked at Claire. He was entirely unprepared for a refusal. Was he? He asked. He has lived 30 years believing that his voice is the final authority. Claire responded, her voice cool and detached. He has never encountered a scenario where his commands did not dictate reality. We spent the rest of the evening reviewing the documentation I had compiled over the past 2 years. Every commendation, every project audit, and every hour of overtime was organized and ready for presentation. Monday, June 16th, was the first day of the rest of Arthur's life, though he remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of his error. I set my alarm for the early hours, laid out my charcoal suit, and prepared for the final act. I felt no nervousness, only a cold, logical necessity. This sport he had belittled for 6 years was about to return, and this time, I would not be an employee seeking approval. I would be the architect of his professional obsolescence. The silence was ending, and the gravity of the situation was about to become impossible for Arthur to ignore. The morning of Monday, June 16th, began with a clarity I had not experienced in years. I donned the charcoal suit that Arthur had once criticized as a touch too ostentatious for the office and drove to Barangaroo. I arrived at exactly 8:59 a.m., stepping into the reception area of Sterling Equity Partners with the deliberate calm of a man whose arrival was not a disruption, but a correction. The office, usually a hive of orchestrated activity, went quiet the moment I crossed the threshold. Lola, the administrative lead who had managed my schedule for years, looked up from her console. Her eyes registered a complex sequence of emotions: relief, sudden panic, and then the ironclad professional mask she had perfected over a decade. Mr. Sterling is currently presiding over a department head meeting in the main conference suite, she said, her voice strained. He was not expecting your presence, Liam. I am aware, I replied, my tone pleasant yet entirely final. However, the agenda for this morning has been amended. I bypassed her desk and proceeded toward the conference suite. The doors were glass, providing a full view of the interior. Arthur was standing at the head of the mahogany table, looking every bit of his age, his posture rigid. Beside him sat Hank Prudhomme, looking visibly uncomfortable, while Carol Stanton, the board's most influential swing vote, sat at the far end, her attention focused on her tablet with the detached interest of someone who had seen every version of corporate theater imaginable. As I pushed the doors open, 7 heads turned in unison. Arthur's reaction was not a flinch, nor an outburst. It was a visible, agonizing recalibration. He had expected a contrite employee seeking reinstatement or perhaps a frantic negotiation. Instead, he encountered a version of me that he no longer possessed the authority to dismiss. I pulled out a chair, helped myself to the coffee service, and poured a cup with measured, agonizing slowness. You were terminated on Friday, Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly warning. You're not an employee of this firm. You have no authorization to be in this room. My status is currently being reevaluated, I replied, taking a composed sip of coffee. I have requested a formal session with Donna Merritt to address the procedural irregularities of my separation. I believe a review of our founding charter is in order. Arthur's jaw began that slow, rhythmic grinding that signaled a loss of composure. Get out of my building, he ordered, his voice rising in volume. I will depart when my questions are answered, I stated, locking eyes with him. Tell Donna I will be at the Tavern in the Rocks. She knows the protocol. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked around the table. Good morning, everyone. Carol, the new acquisition strategy looks promising. I walked out into the corridor, the silence behind me echoing with the sound of a kingdom beginning to fracture. Donna Merritt would call within the hour. I was certain of it. She was, above all else, a professional who understood that when a foundational document is invoked, the personal politics of the CEO becomes secondary to the survival of the firm. Donna Merritt contacted me at 11:47 a.m., exactly as the strategic momentum of the morning demanded. I was seated at a quiet corner table in the Tavern at the Rocks, reviewing my notes while the hum of the city moved past the windows. Her voice, usually a model of detached professionalism, carried a slight, uncharacteristic tension. We need to discuss the implications of your arrival this morning, Liam, she stated without preamble. Not at the office. Somewhere private. Her request confirmed my assessment. She had spent her morning consulting the firm's archives, and she had undoubtedly discovered the legal reality of Section 14, subsection C. We met at 1 p.m. Donna arrived with the precision expected of a senior counsel, carrying a leather portfolio that I knew contained a printed copy of the founding charter. She sat across from me, ordered a sparkling water, and observed my half-finished glass of beer with no discernible judgment. You are aware of the gravity of what you are invoking, she began, her tone professional but guarded. You are claiming 18% of Sterling Equity Partners based on current market valuations, which is a figure that would essentially dismantle the firm's liquidity. I am aware of the numbers, Donna, I replied. I'm also aware that the clause is unambiguous. I have spent 2 years ensuring my record is beyond reproach. There is no documented cause for my termination because there is no cause, period. It was a verbal dismissal delivered while I was on approved leave. The optics of that, let alone the legality, will be catastrophic for the firm's reputation during the upcoming board review. Donna closed her eyes briefly, processing the cold logic of the situation. She had served Arthur for over a decade, yet she possessed a level of intellect that prioritized institutional stability over blind loyalty to an aging, erratic patriarch. She opened her portfolio and turned the document toward me, revealing the clause highlighted in yellow. "He fired you while you were in Paris," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He did not even consult the legal department. He acted entirely on his own impulse." She looked up, her expression shifting from cautious to analytical. "If this reaches the board, they will be forced to acknowledge the validity of the charter. Arthur has spent 30 years operating as if he were above the rules his own father wrote. He is not above them," I stated firmly. "He is simply finally subject to them." Donna remained silent for a long moment, staring at the document. "I cannot represent you due to the obvious conflict of interest," she said, finally gathering her papers. "However, I can advise you on the necessary steps to secure external counsel who will be able to leverage this effectively." She pulled a business card from her portfolio and slid it across the table. "She is the most formidable negotiator in the city. She will recognize the value of this case immediately." She rose to leave, then paused. "The board meets on Thursday for the quarterly review. Carol Stanton will chair the governance committee. Attendance is open to any active stakeholder, which you technically remain until this claim is adjudicated." She did not wait for a response, simply turning and disappearing into the bustling street, leaving me with the final piece of the architecture for Arthur's decline. The trap was not only set, it was now effectively triggered. The Thursday board meeting commenced with a gravity that transcended the standard quarterly proceedings. I arrived at 8:40 a.m., accompanied by Victoria Reese, a litigator whose reputation for clinical, unrelenting excellence preceded her in every boardroom in Sydney. We did not need to announce our presence. The atmosphere in the suite on the 18th floor was already suffocating. Arthur sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face a mask of controlled rage, with Hank Prudhomme and Preston, his two most compliant subordinates, flanking him like sentinels of a crumbling empire. Carol Stanton occupied the far end, her expression unreadable, a legal pad before her that she had yet to utilize. Victoria distributed 12 bound copies of the 1987 founding charter to each director, the silence broken only by the sharp rustle of paper. Arthur did not even bother to look at his copy. He stared directly at me, his jaw grinding with such intensity it was almost audible. "This is a pathetic attempt at extortion," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "It is a legal instrument, Mr. Sterling," Victoria replied, her tone matching that of a patient academic correcting a fundamental error in a student's work. "It is a provision written into the very fabric of your firm's inception. Liam has provided 6 years of unblemished service. His termination was verbal, unauthorized, and entirely devoid of documented cause. The mathematics of the resulting equity claim are not a matter of opinion. They are a matter of record." Arthur turned his gaze toward Donna Merritt, who was seated centrally, effectively bridging the distance between the two factions. "Tell them it is unenforceable," he commanded. Donna looked up, her gaze steady. "The clause is enforceable, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of any hesitation. "I have spent the last 3 days searching for a legal mechanism to invalidate the provision, and I have found none. It is binding." The air in the room seemed to thin. Arthur, realizing the walls had finally closed in, abandoned all pretense of professional decorum. He turned to me, his voice trembling with a toxic blend of bitterness and perceived superiority. "You were always a passenger in this firm," he declared, his eyes cold. "I gave you a position only because my daughter's sentimentality demanded it. You have contributed nothing, yet you possess the audacity to claim a stake in a legacy you could never have built yourself." "Dad!" The word cut through the tension like a blade. Claire, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood and walked toward the center of the room. She looked at her father with a chilling, detached clarity. I watched you dismantle Mom's confidence at every dinner party for 20 years, she said, her voice steady and profoundly quiet. I watched you force her to leave because she was no longer a person to you, but a liability to be managed. You treated Liam with that same arrogant condescension from the first day you met him, believing that your title made your cruelty invisible. She stopped just feet from him. You built this firm on your father's capital and the systemic erosion of your employees' dignity. Today, you are paying the price for that hubris. You did not fire Liam because of his performance. You fired him because a photograph of a city you could not control wounded your ego. The room went deathly silent. Claire sat back down, leaving Arthur standing in the center of his own ruin. Carol Stanton cleared her throat, her gaze moving slowly around the table, all in favor of recognizing the equity claim under Section 14, subsection C. 7 hands rose, a unanimous verdict. Arthur sank into his chair, his silence finally absolute. The boardroom had spoken, and the Sterling legacy had effectively ended. The aftermath of the board's decision did not unfold in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, grinding erosion of a legacy built on sand. Within weeks, the structural weaknesses I had exposed began to trigger a series of cascading failures. Former employees, emboldened by the board's recognition of the charter, surfaced with documentation detailing years of hostile work environments and systematic discrimination. Arthur's legal expenses began to compound with such velocity that his attorneys eventually stopped offering the pretense of a victory, instead advising a swift, quiet divestment. The board, having seen the firm's valuation threatened by Arthur's continued presence, moved with clinical efficiency to remove him from his position. He resisted the sale of his remaining equity for exactly 14 days, the duration of a man clinging to an identity that no longer existed. Then, realizing that pride is a luxury he could no longer afford, he signed the documents in a sterile room in Barangaroo, without ceremony, without an audience, and with a finality that signaled the end of his 30-year tenure. I sold my 18% stake to Carol Stanton a fortnight later. My associate asked me 3 times, with increasing volume, why I chose to liquidate rather than participate in the future of the firm. I provided the same answer each time. I never desired the company. I desired only the clause. I sought only to witness the moment when a man who had spent his life making others feel small was finally required to sit at the table as an equal to those he had spent decades diminishing. That objective had been achieved. The rest was merely administrative. Claire and I sat at our kitchen table in Vaucluse one last time, the same space where the founding charter had first been laid out 2 years prior. The city light hit the harbor with an indifferent, shimmering beauty, completely unbothered by the collapse of the Sterling Empire. "Where to?" she asked, her voice light, unburdened by the weight of her father's history. "Somewhere that does not know his name," I replied. She nodded, a subtle smile playing on her lips, and began the process of closing our life in Sydney. We were gone by August. Margaret, Claire's mother, received the full account over the phone, and after a long silence, she responded with the composure of a woman who had earned every syllable of her newfound peace. "I always knew the firm would eventually run out of people willing to sacrifice their dignity for his convenience." We moved forward, leaving the ghosts of Barangaroo to settle into the silence of the harbor. Some men spend their existence constructing kingdoms, convinced that their authority is a permanent feature of the landscape. Arthur Sterling had spent 30 years building his, only to lose it on a Thursday in July because he could not suppress his ego long enough to endure a photograph from Paris. It was the end of 6 years of being called a subordinate, 1 clause, 1 period of strategic patience, and a woman who had been keeping score since she was 12. We left the city behind, entirely unconcerned with what remained of the kingdom we had dismantled.